I just want to congratulate Concordia Visiting Nurses on their 20th anniversary. I have many fond memories of the starting days of Concordia Visiting Nurses. I want to just give you an example to share with you how successful they have become. In 1997, Concordia's annual revenues were $9 million. 20 years later, Concordia Visiting Nurses as a company is 4 times larger than all of Concordia was just 20 years ago. Also, I want to tell another story about Concordia's strategic planning in the late 1990s. We realized that there was one simple truth that drove all of our planning. That truth was this, that the population was aging rapidly and that the government wouldn't be able to pay for it. Based on that one simple truth, we formulated 3 plans. The first plan was to expand into personal care. We thought that people would move from skilled care to personal care. The second plan is that we started building private rooms because we realized that long-term care would soon be substituted by short-term services better served in private rooms. And finally, the grand slam of all of those ideas was that the government would soon be moving more and more care into the community, that would be the only way they would be able to afford to serve the age wave. That was the conception of the idea of forming Concordia Visiting Nurses. All I can say is 20 years later, you hit the ball out of the park. Congratulations.
I remember way back in the mid-1990s where I was on the board of directors and I was appointed chairperson of long-range planning. And so Keith had always given us points to consider, things that we might want to take a look at for the future of Concordia. So this one particular evening here, he brought in a guest, a young man who was to sit in front of us. Now, this committee and the board was really not a rubber stamp of Keith's directives. And so consequently what they did was they peppered this young man. They asked him about what can home health do for us? What can home care do for us? And you know, he answered the questions very well. And when he was dismissed, the committee deliberated and made a recommendation to go back to the board to start home care. And that young man was Marty Truttle. He went through a whole barrage of stuff, and 20 years later, he is the president and CEO of Concordia Visiting Nurses.
Over 20 years ago, when I was hired by Concordia Lutheran Ministries, the strategic goal was for me to initiate private duty services. I was very familiar and comfortable with this type of healthcare delivery. However, within 90 days of being hired and initiating these programs, the board and Keith asked me to initiate professional home health services.
Well, as someone who grew up and lived in this area all my life, I was quite entrenched with Concordia. I worked here. That's how I decided to be a nurse. And I was between jobs, working a couple different part-time jobs, and I said I wanted to have a meeting with Mr. Frendak, and I went in and told him that they should start a home care agency. Of course, little did I know that that is exactly what they were planning on doing. And I said I wanted to make sure that I was hired, and I was. Michelle Hartman and I were the first 2 nurses that came here. I actually don't remember this story, but they said that I was the one who took the Medicare survey around when we got our license.
So initially, I had to read through all the regulations and so forth in order for us to apply for licensure under professional home health here in the state of Pennsylvania and to become certified with the Medicare program. Back in those days, you were allowed to actually request a meeting with the Department of Health and meet with a surveyor and kind of go over your plan. When I did that, way back when, I remember the surveyor's name. Her name was Jane Sutton, and I drove the whole way up to Meadville to meet with her. And at that time, she actually gave me the information about the Pennsylvania Home Care Association and encouraged me and our organization to join them.
So how I started with Concordia Visiting Nurses is I actually interviewed with Paul Brand at Concordia Lutheran Ministries. And I didn't get the position, but he passed on his resume to Marty for Concordia Visiting Nurses. I was working at another home health agency down in Fox Chapel, and we were not doing well. Things were not going well for us. We had more managed care patients than we had Medicare, and managed care was not paying well. We ended up closing our doors, and it just so happened that I got the position here at the same time. So we had to transfer our patients, obviously, from our old home health agency because we were closing. We offered patient choice, and a lot of them chose Concordia Visiting Nurses.
One of the funniest things I can remember about working here was not too long after I started, I was having some difficulties with my car. And I called in, I had patients to see in Butler. I called in the office to let them know my car wouldn't start, and Marty, who had answered the phone at the time, wanted to know where I lived and was more than happy to pick me up and take me to my clients for the day. So he came to my home, picked me up, took me to see my clients, came back 4 hours later, picked me up and took me home again. So we went above and beyond even then.
With Julie's story, it's so accurate because we were small. I was able to help our employees, you know, if their car broke down, if they needed something else. And so as we continued to grow and get bigger and bigger, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that for all of the employees, but I still know many of them by name. I engage them every day when they're here in the office. It's very, very rewarding to realize that we have almost over several hundred employees in 5 to 9 different counties on any given day.
Well, Mr. Frendra kept raising the bar on you. So if you made 100 this week, then he wanted 200 next week. So you were always trying to reach that bar, which we kept doing. So, I mean, that's been the fun part, is watching the agency grow and watching these young nurses and how they've all progressed, and now we have them there in supervisory roles. And I mean, I've always thought that was a neat thing.
Joan, I have known her since I've started in home health. She told me when I first started here as a graduate nurse that I would go places and do great things, and she was absolutely right. I started out in the field and again grew into a director position, and Joan was a big part of that. She's been my mentor over the past 15 years, and the real home health guru, and without her, you know, I'm not sure that I would be where I am today.
Well, probably one of the best stories that I can tell you is when I was out in the field seeing a patient way out in like the Hooker area, out in the farm country. I was going to see a patient, and this big ram with these big horns was stopped in the middle of the road and wouldn't move. So I got out of my car and just see what I could do, and this ram started chasing me up the hill till I just literally about passed out up there. And I said I was scared to death. Went back to see my patient. Pretty much what they were telling me was, as there is a side of the road that has, I guess, male rams and female rams on the other side of the road, and it was breeding season, and I was interfering with the mating, you know, the mate of these rams. And I said I just thought that I was going to end my nursing career right there in the middle of this field, being trampled to death by a ram.
One of my favorite stories from the early days is before uniforms and before name tags, we wore street clothes. And I always had a white lab coat to put things in my pockets, and I wonder now what I did put in my pockets, because we didn't have pulse oximeters then, we didn't have temporal thermometers, we didn't have our smartphones, so I'm not sure what were in our pockets, but I know I always wore a lab coat because I needed pockets. Anyway, I called a patient and said I'll be there at 11 o'clock tomorrow. So they hadn't known me from last year, and they said, well, great, we're looking forward to seeing you. So I show up a little late. The first patient took longer than I thought, and I show up about 11:30, and the patient's husband meets me at the door, and he says, you know, you were just here. And I said, what? I said, yeah, we thought it was you. We just had a lady in our house. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, this lady came up, and we thought, boy, Lynn's changed a lot in a year, but she had a white coat on and she had a bag like you carry. So we brought her in and we sat down at the kitchen table, and she pulls a Bible out of her bag and sat down and started reading to us. So it was a Jehovah's Witness who came to their door. So now we have uniforms, we're highly recognizable, we have name tags, so that's the first thing I show through the door when the patient opens the door.
Initially, we were paper pencil. That's what I would refer to in home health. All charting was here in our Cabot office. And the clinicians would have to come in and drop off their documentation, would have to process their documentation and file it. And of course, then other clinicians would need to come in and review the patient's chart before going out to provide maybe therapy services or medical social work services. Around 2006, 2007, we realized we really needed to implement an electronic medical record. We finally were able to do that in 2008. It was a very, very large step for us. But as home health became more complex and there were more and more regulations, our state association actually references that there are more regulations in home health care than there are in a nuclear power plant. So it's become very sophisticated, and strategically we moved in the right direction. We have now implemented a second phase of EMR. We've gone to home care home base, very excited about it. We're just about through that implementation process, and it again is very rewarding.